It was a cold night in November of 2004 when a fire broke out in a quiet neighborhood in the English city of Manchester. When firefighters arrived at the scene, they found a man's body inside the burned-out shell of a home. The victim had been identified as 71-year-old James Atfield. But how did he die? Was it an accident, or was there foul play involved? And if so, who was responsible for his untimely demise? Despite extensive investigations, this shocking true crime case remains unsolved to this day. So join me as we revisit the haunting details of this case and explore the theories that continue to surround it. James Atfield lived alone in his home at Windermere Avenue. He was described by those who knew him as a private but friendly man. According to his friends, James had recently received a letter from someone known as Billie Eilish, threatening to harm him. Police believe that this individual may have had something to do with the death of Mr. Atfield. But why would anyone want to hurt such a seemingly harmless man? And what could this mysterious letter contain that would lead to such a horrific outcome? As the investigation got underway, detectives uncovered more disturbing details about the case. The house had been set ablaze sometime between 9:30 p.m. on November and 6:30 a.m. the following morning. And the fire was so intense that it took 60 firefighters over for hours to bring it under control. It quickly became apparent that this was just a random act of vandalism or an electrical fire gone wrong. Someone had deliberately torched the house, and poor James had lost his life in the blaze. The victim's body was found lying face down on the living room floor, wrapped in a blanket with tape over his mouth and plastic bags stuffed in his nostrils. There were also rope marks around his wrists and ankles, suggesting that he had been bound before the fire. But what was the motive behind such a brutal attack? And who could have been so cruel as to snuff out the life of an innocent elderly gentleman? As the investigation continued, detectives interviewed everyone who had been in contact with Mr. Atfield in the weeks leading up to his death. They discovered that he had recently been involved in a dispute with his neighbors over plans to extend his driveway. This could be a potential motive for his murder, but none of the neighbors had any concrete evidence to support their claims. Could this seemingly mundane issue have escalated into such a violent crime? Or was there something more sinister at play? The police also learned that James had been targeted by thieves in the past, and that his home had been broken into several times before. It seemed like whoever was responsible for the crime knew their way around the house and had specifically targeted Mr. Atfield. In fact, the fire was so intense that it completely destroyed most of the forensic evidence at the scene. However, authorities were able to uncover a few crucial clues. A post-mortem examination revealed that Mr. Atfield had not died as a result of the fire, but rather had been smothered to death. His hands had also been bound behind his back with a ligature, indicating that he had been held captive for some time before the fatal attack. These findings suggested that this was no ordinary crime. This was the work of a madman who had taken his time to plan out every detail of his heinous crime. But who could be responsible for such a calculated and brutal attack? As the investigation progressed, the police began to focus on 3 men who had all been in prison with the victim's son, Michael. At some point in the past, Michael had served time for burglary and had connections to Manchester's criminal underworld. Could his past come back to haunt him and his family in the form of a deadly revenge plot? One of the men in prison with Michael was Christopher Guest, a convicted arsonist who had been released from prison just weeks before the murder. Guest was known to frequent the area and had even been seen loitering around Mr. Atfield's house in the days leading up to the murder. Could this be nothing more than a terrifying coincidence, or is there a more sinister connection between Guest and the crime? The police also learned that another one of Michael's former cellmates, Paul Simpson, had recently been released from prison and had a history of violence against the elderly. Simpson was considered a dangerous individual, and the police were concerned that he could be hiding somewhere in the area. Could this be yet another case of a vengeful ex-con, or are the police on the wrong track entirely? And then there was Mark Isherwood, Michael's third former cellmate, who had been convicted for sexually assaulting an elderly woman. Isherwood was described as being obsessed with knives and had a history of mental illness. Could his disturbing past make him the perfect suspect in this gruesome murder? To make matters even more perplexing, James's son, Michael, had disappeared shortly after his father's funeral. The police were unable to locate him, and he vanished without a trace. This development added another layer of mystery to the case and raised suspicion about Michael's involvement in the crime. Could he have been protecting his own involvement by staging the crime scene and destroying the evidence? Or was he truly innocent and hiding out of fear that he would become the prime suspect in his father's murder? As the years went by, the case grew colder and colder, and the hope of finding the person responsible for James's death seemed to fade away. But in 2008, a breakthrough finally occurred. A man named Brian Duffy came forward and claimed to have information about the case. Could this be the break that the police had been waiting for? According to Duffy, he had been drinking with Christopher Guest, Paul Simpson, and Mark Isherwood the night of the murder, and they had boasted to him that they had killed James Adfield. Could this be the evidence that the police needed to finally solve the case? However, despite Duffy's claims, none of the three men could be linked directly to the crime. They had alibis for the time of the murder, and there was no physical evidence to connect them to the scene of the crime. The case was eventually closed with no suspects and no answers. But what really happened to James Adfield? Who was responsible for his death? And why was the case never solved? One theory is that the three men, Christopher Guest, Paul Simpson, and Mark Isherwood, acted alone. They could have planned the murder together while incarcerated and carried it out once they were free. But why would they boast about their crime to a stranger? Perhaps they were drunk and inebriated at the time. Or maybe they were trying to frame Duffy for the murder. Another possibility is that only one of the three men was responsible for the crime, and the other two were innocent. If this is the case, then who was the killer? All three of the men had access to the victim's house, as they had all been inside at different times in the past. However, only Mark Isherwood had a motive to kill Mr. Adfield. Isherwood was known to be obsessed with knives and had a history of mental illness. He could have snapped and murdered Mr. Adfield in a fit of rage. However, there is no evidence to support this theory. What about the mysterious letter that Mr. Adfield received prior to his death? Could it have been a red herring, a clue that the police overlooked? Or is there a more sinister meaning behind its contents? Perhaps the letter was a message from Billie Eilish, a shadowy figure who lurked on the fringes of the investigation. Whoever this individual is, they clearly hold the key to solving the mystery of James's death. Sadly, this case has been shrouded in mystery and speculation ever since the victim's body was found in that burnt-out house. While the police were able to rule out certain individuals and narrow down the possibilities, they were never able to gather enough evidence to charge anyone with the crime. The victim's family has been left without answers and closure, and the true killer continues to walk free. This case serves as a reminder of the darkness that can lurk within our society and the lengths to which some people will go to satisfy their twisted desires. The brutal murder of James Adfield is a tragic example of the senseless violence that can erupt even in the most unsuspecting of communities. If you have any information about this case, please contact the police. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to my channel.